Graham Holloway didn't believe in blind dates. He believed in quarterly earnings, in due diligence, in things you could verify before you committed. But his sister had set this one up through some app she swore by, and after 8 months of nothing but boardrooms and red-eye flights between Toronto and Calgary, even he had to admit the apartment was starting to feel like a hotel room he happened to own. The restaurant was the kind of place with candlelight that flattered everyone, tucked into a converted warehouse on King Street West, exposed brick and low jazz. Graham arrived 7 minutes early because he always did, and he saw her before she saw him. A woman with dark, wind-blown hair sitting alone at a corner table, hands folded, a small device tucked behind her ear that caught the light when she turned her head. He didn't know yet that her name was Imogen Caro. He only knew that she looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, and that something about the careful stillness of her posture made him slow his steps. He was 3 feet from the table when the trouble started. Oh, for God's sake. The voice came from the next booth over, a man in a checked blazer leaning toward his own date, not even bothering to lower his voice. Is that thing a hearing aid? She's deaf. Wonderful. The app really outdid itself tonight. He laughed, short and ugly, and his date gave an uncomfortable titter that was somehow worse than if she'd laughed along properly. The restaurant didn't go silent the way restaurants do in movies. It was worse than that. It kept moving, forks still scraping, but everyone's eyes slid sideways, the way people look at a car accident they don't want to admit they're looking at. Imogen's face didn't crumple. That was the first thing Graham noticed, and it would stay with him long after that night was over. She didn't flinch, didn't reach up to touch the hearing aid self-consciously. She simply sat there, jaw tight, gaze fixed somewhere past the candle, the kind of stillness that costs a person something to hold. She'd caught enough of it. Lip-reading, maybe, or just the universal grammar of cruelty, the laugh, the pointing chin, the way people's bodies turn slightly away from her like you're contagious. Graham didn't decide to do anything. His body simply moved the way it sometimes did in a negotiation gone sideways, before his mind had finished drafting the sentence. "Is there a problem?" he said, low and even, stopping beside the man's table. The man in the blazer looked up, irritated at the interruption, then recognized him. Graham watched it happen, the little flicker of "oh, that's Holloway from Brightline," and some of the swagger drained out of his face. Money recognizes money the way dogs recognize other dogs, and apparently it also recognizes the specific frequency of money that can end a career with one phone call. "No problem," the man muttered. "Just talking, then talk quieter," Graham said, "or talk somewhere else." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked to the corner table where the woman with the hearing aid was watching him with an expression that wasn't gratitude. Not yet, but something more guarded, like she was waiting to see what he wanted in return. "Graham," he said, and instead of holding out his hand the way he would have at a board meeting, he pulled out the chair across from her and sat, so they were closer to eye level than if he'd loomed over her standing. He'd learned that much, somewhere, about people who'd spent a lifetime being talked at. "Imogen," she said. Her voice had a particular shape to it, careful in its consonants, the voice of someone who'd worked hard for clarity. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She studied him a long moment, like she was deciding whether that sentence was a performance or not. Whatever she found in his face seemed to satisfy her, at least provisionally, because some of the rigidity went out of her shoulders. "I should tell you," she said, "before this goes any further, I'm not the date you matched with on the app. I was supposed to meet someone named Devin at this table at 7. He didn't show. I've been sitting here for 40 minutes telling myself I'd give it 10 more before I left." Graham almost laughed. Of all the ways a night could go sideways. "Then I'm not your date either," he said. "I was matched with someone named... Actually, I don't remember. I was working until 6 and barely looked at the profile, so we're both here under false pretenses. Looks that way." She tilted her head and something in her face shifted, not quite a smile, but the door to one. "Well," she said, "I haven't eaten, have you?" That was how it started. Not with the app. Not with the matched profiles that would sit unread in both their phones for weeks, but with 2 strangers who'd each been stood up, sharing a table because the alternative was going home to an empty apartment, thinking about a stranger's cruelty. He learned more about her in that first dinner than he usually learned about people in months of acquaintance. She ran a garage on the East End, inherited from her father Walter Caro, who died 4 years ago, and left her the business along with 30 years of regular customers who trusted the Caro name more than they trusted any dealership. She'd been deaf since she was 9, the result of a fever that nearly killed her, and took most of her hearing on the way out. She read lips better than most people read subtitles. She'd learned to fix engines the way some people learn music, by feel and vibration as much as sound. Most men get weird about it, she said, halfway through her pasta, watching him with the directness of someone used to gauging reactions in real time. Either they overcompensate, talk too loud, too slow, like I'm simple, or they get embarrassed in public, the way Mr. Checked Blazer back there did. You're doing neither, and I'm trying to figure out if that's an act. It's not an act, Graham said. I just don't see what there is to be embarrassed about. Most CEOs I've met would disagree. Image is everything in your world, isn't it? He thought about that, about Brightline's brand consultants, about the careful curation of every photo that went out under his name, about his mother's voice in his head reminding him. Always, we are what people see us as. Maybe, he admitted, but I'm getting tired of my world. She laughed at that, a real laugh, surprised out of her. That's the most honest thing a rich man's ever said to me. He walked her to her truck that night, an old Ford, dented along one fender, smelling faintly of motor oil even from the outside, and he didn't ask for her number. He asked if he could come by the garage sometime, just to see it, and she'd looked at him like she was recalculating something and said, "Sure, we're open Tuesdays through Saturdays. Try not to wear a suit." He came by the following Tuesday in a flannel shirt he hadn't worn since university, and she laughed at him for trying too hard, and that was the second time he heard that laugh, and he started quietly to organize his week around the hope of hearing it again. The weeks that followed weren't dramatic. That was what surprised him most. How little drama there was in falling for someone, how it happened instead in increments so small he could barely mark them as they passed. He learned to sign a handful of words, badly, from a phone app he was too proud to admit he was using. And the first time he managed "thank you" and "I'm sorry" in the same sentence without fumbling, she'd gone very quiet and then said, "Nobody's ever bothered to learn that for me before. Not even people I dated for years." He learned that she hated being asked to read his lips slower, because slowing down distorted the shapes of words more than speaking normally did. He learned that loud restaurants weren't actually harder for her than quiet ones, because she relied on faces, not volume. He learned the specific, careful way she touched an engine block before she ever picked up a tool, like she was listening to it with her hands. One Thursday evening, closing up the garage together, he'd taken to staying late to help her cash out. Badly, fumbling with the till in ways that made her swat his hands away laughing. A wrench slipped off the workbench and clattered against the concrete floor near her foot. She didn't startle. He did, lunging instinctively to catch it before it could roll under the lift, and in doing so knocked over a can of bolts that scattered everywhere. She watched him scramble after them on his knees in his $300 trousers, and she started laughing so hard she had to lean against the workbench. "You don't have to do that," she said when she could speak again. "I'm not going to break." "I know," he said, still picking up bolts. "I wanted to." It was the same sentence from that first night, and she went quiet the way she had then. And when he looked up, she was watching him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Something unguarded, something that looked almost like fear. The particular fear of a person who is starting to want something they've trained themselves not to want. That night, she invited him up to the small apartment above the garage, the one Walter Caro had lived in for 30 years before her, and she made him tea in mismatched mugs and showed him her father's old logbooks, decades of handwriting, recording every car that had ever passed through those bay doors. She told him about the year her mother left, about the fever, about learning to read lips in a hospital room, because nobody had thought to teach her sign language until she was 11. He told her about his father's heart attack at 51, about inheriting Brightline at 28 before he was ready, about his mother, Eleanor, who had run the company like a monarchy ever since, and treated his marriage prospects like a line item on a strategic plan. "She's going to hate me," Imogen said, not as a question. "She hates most things that aren't quarterly growth," Graham said, and tried to make it sound like a joke, and didn't quite manage it. He should have known his mother would find out before he told her. Eleanor Holloway had built her reputation on knowing things before they were announced, and a society photographer's long lens had caught Graham and Imogen on a sidewalk patio, laughing, his hand resting on the back of her chair. The way it had taken him weeks to learn was welcome and not patronizing. The photo ran in a gossip column with the caption "Brightline's Bachelor CEO spotted with mystery woman." A mechanic? And within 2 days, Graham was summoned to the Holloway townhouse in Rosedale, the kind of summons that arrived as an invitation and functioned as a subpoena. His mother received him in the sitting room, a glass of Sancerre untouched on the side table, her posture as composed as a held breath. "I assume you've seen the photographs," she said. "I have. And I assume you understand the position this puts us in. Brightline is in the middle of the Halloran acquisition. Our investors expect a certain image, stability. Pedigree not," she paused delicately. "A garage mechanic from the East End. Her name is Imogen," Graham said. "She runs her own business. She inherited it from her father and built it into something profitable on her own. No investors. No loans she didn't pay back early. If you're talking about stability, Mother, you could do worse than someone who's never once asked me for anything." Eleanor's expression didn't change, which was somehow worse than if it had. "Is she deaf?" "Yes, Graham." His mother set down her glass with the careful precision of someone controlling her own hands. "I am not unsympathetic, but you cannot put a woman like that in front of the board, in front of investors, in front of the press, and expect this company's image to survive it intact. People will say things. They will already be saying things. Let them. It isn't only about you anymore. You inherited this company from your father. You have an obligation to it." "I have an obligation to myself, too," Graham said, and was surprised by how steady his own voice came out. "I'm 38 years old. I've spent my entire adult life building this company exactly the way you wanted it built. I'm not asking your permission about who I love." His mother's face went very still, and something passed behind her eyes that he couldn't read. Not quite anger, something older and more tired than that. "Then you'll learn the cost of that on your own," she said quietly, and rose and left the room, and Graham understood with a sinking certainty that this was not the end of the conversation. It was only the part of it he'd been allowed to hear. 2 weeks later, 2 men he didn't recognize were waiting for him in the parking garage beneath Brightline's offices. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't need to. One of them said, "Mr. Holloway's mother sends her regards," with the particular flatness of men who are paid by the hour and not by the conscience. And then they explained, with their fists, exactly how seriously Eleanor Holloway took the matter of her son's reputation. Graham didn't go to the police. He understood, with a clarity that hurt almost as much as his ribs did, that the message had not really been for him. It had been a preview, a warning shot fired in his direction, so that he would understand what could happen to Imogen if he didn't end it himself, cleanly, before his mother's patience ran further out. He sat in his car in the parking garage for 40 minutes afterward, pressing a torn shop rag. One Imogen had given him weeks ago, half as a joke, "You'll need this if you keep crawling around my garage floor," against the cut above his eyebrow, and composed in his head the cruelest sentence he had ever written. "I think we should stop seeing each other. I'm not in the right place for this right now." He typed it 3 times before he sent it. He told himself it was protection. He told himself a lot of things that night, in the dark, alone, and none of them made the act of pressing send feel like anything other than betrayal. Imogen didn't call. He'd expected her to call, to demand an explanation, and the silence was somehow worse than anger would have been. He went to the garage twice, and watched from across the street, telling himself he wasn't allowed to go in, that going in would undo the only thing he'd managed to do right in this whole disaster, which was put distance between her and the version of his world that could hurt her. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing. Sitting alone in his glass office with a bruise yellowing along his jaw, was that Imogen had spent those same nights in the apartment above the garage with the lights off, staring at her father's logbooks without reading them. The silence in her ears now matched by a silence everywhere else. She'd grown up learning that people left. Her mother had left when speech therapy got too expensive and grief got too heavy. And now the one person who'd learned her language, badly on purpose, just to talk to her. He'd left too, the same as everyone, except this one had the decency to send a text first. She didn't cry, not at first. She went numb instead, the particular numbness of someone who has decided, finally and completely, that trusting people is a luxury she can't afford. It was raining the night everything changed. The kind of late November Toronto rain that turns the streets to black mirrors and makes every streetlight bloom into a smear of gold. Imogen had closed the garage early, telling herself she was just going for a walk, knowing somewhere underneath that lie that her feet were carrying her toward the part of the city where Brightline's tower stood, glass and indifferent, 20 floors of a life she'd never wanted, and a man she couldn't stop wanting anyway. She didn't see the car until it was nearly on top of her. Windshield wipers struggling against the downpour, the driver going too fast around the curve by the streetcar tracks. She heard nothing, the way she'd heard nothing her whole life when sound mattered most. No horn, no screech of tires until they were already happening, and her body simply froze on the wet pavement, hands too slow, the world narrowing to a pair of headlights. Then there were arms around her hauling her sideways, and the heat of someone's chest against her cheek. And when she looked up through the rain, it was Graham, soaked through, hair plastered to his forehead, the cut above his eyebrow reopened and bleeding faintly pink in the downpour. His eyes wild with a fear that had nothing to do with the car that had just missed them both. "I saw you," he said, and she could just make out the words on his lips even through the chaos. "I was coming to find you. I saw you crossing in the car." His voice broke off entirely. "You left me," she said when she could speak. Her hands were fisted in the front of his soaked jacket. "You didn't even let me ask why. I thought I was protecting you." His face crumpled in a way she'd never seen on him, all his careful composure gone. "My mother sent men after me. They put me in a parking garage and made it very clear what they'd do to you if I didn't end it myself. I thought if I disappeared, you'd be safe. I thought that was the kindest thing I could do. You think I needed you to decide that for me?" Her voice shook, but her eyes didn't leave his face, reading every word off his lips with a desperate hunger. "What I needed was the truth. I've spent my whole life with people deciding things about me without asking. I thought you were different. I am sorry," he said, and this time she watched the words form slowly, carefully, like he needed her to see every one of them. "I am so sorry, Imogen." She reached up, her hand trembling, whether from cold or something else she couldn't have said, and touched the blood at his eyebrow. And then, before either of them had decided anything, she pulled him down and kissed him in the middle of the empty, rain-soaked street, the two of them drenched and shaking and entirely unwilling to let go. When they broke apart, foreheads pressed together, rain running down both their faces, she said, "I don't care what your mother thinks. I don't care about the company or the investors or any of it. I want this. I want you. You're going to freeze," Graham said, voice cracking. "Too late," she said. And for the first time, since the restaurant, since the photo, since the text message that had nearly ended everything, Graham Holloway felt something settle in his chest that he could only call certainty. He took her to the Brightline boardroom 3 days later, not the townhouse. He wanted his mother to face this on the ground where she'd built her power, not on home turf where the rules always bent toward her. Eleanor was already seated at the head of the long glass table when they walked in, composed as ever, though something in her eyes flickered when she saw the faint scar still healing above her son's brow. "I see you've brought her here," Eleanor said. "I have," Graham said, "because I want you to say to her face whatever it is you think justifies sending men to put their hands on your own son." Eleanor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I did what was necessary to protect this family's interests." "Has more of a right to be in my life than anyone you've ever chosen for me," Graham said, and beside him Imogen stood straight-backed, watching the older woman's mouth, with the same unflinching attention she gave every difficult conversation, missing nothing. "You are the CEO of a publicly traded company," Eleanor said, rising slowly. "Your choices are not only your own, you owe this company." "I never asked to inherit it," Graham said, cutting her off, and his voice didn't rise, but it didn't waver either. "I took it because Dad died and someone had to. I have run it exactly the way you wanted for 10 years. I have given this family everything it asked of me. I am not giving it her." Eleanor's composure cracked, just slightly, at the edges. "And if I told you that choosing her costs you the chairmanship? That the board will not stand behind a CEO who—" "Then let them choose someone else," Graham said. "I mean that." Imogen's hand found his, gripping hard enough that he could feel her pulse against his palm. Eleanor stared at her son for a long moment, something old and complicated moving behind her eyes. Not quite defeat, but something adjacent to it. "Then go," she said finally, quietly, "if that's truly what you want." They left without another word, walking together past the floor-to-ceiling windows, past the city spread out gray and rain-washed below, and neither of them looked back. It took 3 months for the dust to settle. Board negotiations, a transition plan that kept Graham on as a strategic advisor while ceding day-to-day control to a chief operating officer he trusted, more money than either of them knew what to do with and far less interest, suddenly, in spending it on anything that wasn't real. The wedding, when it came, was nothing like the kind of event Eleanor Holloway would have planned. It happened in the back lot of the garage, behind the bay doors, under a string of second-hand patio lights, and an Art Imogen's regular customers had built out of scrap pipe and welded daisies, because one of them turned out to be a metal worker on the side and had insisted. Tully, Imogen's 9-year-old nephew, walked down the makeshift aisle scattering bolts and washers from a basket instead of flower petals, because Imogen had said she wanted something that actually meant something to her, and Walter Caro's old logbooks would have approved. Graham stood at the front in a suit that was, for once in his life, slightly wrinkled, because he'd spent the morning helping move folding chairs instead of getting dressed properly, and he thought, watching Imogen walk, slowly, but on her own 2 feet down the gravel toward him, in a simple cream dress, her father's old logbook tucked under one arm as something borrowed, that he had never in his life seen anything so completely, unguardedly happy. Near the end of the ceremony, as the small crowd of mechanics and neighbors and the one cousin Imogen still spoke to went quiet, a car pulled up at the edge of the lot. Eleanor Holloway stepped out, not in the tailored armor she usually wore but in a plain gray coat, looking, for the first time Graham could remember, uncertain of her welcome. She didn't say much. She crossed the lot slowly and stopped in front of Imogen, and after a long pause that felt to Graham like it lasted an hour, she extended her hand. "Take care of him," she said. "That's all I ask." Imogen, reading the words carefully off her lips, took the offered hand and shook it, and something in Eleanor's tightly held shoulders eased, just slightly, like a held breath finally let go. Later that evening, after the cake had been cut on a folding table beside the lift, after the last of the guests had wandered out toward their cars with leftover cookies wrapped in napkins, Graham found Imogen sitting on the tailgate of her old Ford, looking out toward the lake that lay just past the property line, the one her father used to take her to on Sunday mornings before the fever took her hearing. "There's something I never told you," she said when he sat beside her. "I've been seeing a specialist about a new processor. Newer technology, better range than the one I've got. I had the surgery scheduled for next month, but I kept putting it off. I think I was scared of what I'd hear." "And now?" he asked. She smiled, small and a little nervous, the way she had that very first night at the restaurant before any of it had gone wrong. "Now I think I want to hear it. Whatever it is, I want to hear you." He took her hand the way he had on the bridge of rain-soaked street that had changed everything, and didn't say anything else, because for once there was nothing that needed saying. The lake moved quietly in the dark beyond the fence line, and somewhere behind them the patio lights swayed in the evening breeze, and Graham Holloway, who had spent his whole life believing in things he could verify before he committed to them, understood at last that some things were worth believing in before the proof ever came.